History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 4 The Age of Diverging Traditions. Chapter 10 Europe, the First Revolution. The results are very hard to pin down, but they were bound to stimulate further and faster social change. Medieval society changed dramatically and sometimes in oddly assorted ways between the 10th century and the 16th. Even at the end of that age, though it seems still almost unimaginably remote, its obsession with status and hierarchy is one index of this. Medieval European man was defined by his legal status. Instead of being an individual social atom, so to speak, he was the point at which a number of coordinates met. Some of them were set by birth, and the most obvious expression of this was the idea of nobility. The noble society, which was to remain a reality in some places until the 20th century, was already present in its essentials in the 13th. Gradually, warriors had turned into landlords. Descent then became important because there were inheritances to argue about. One indicator was the rise of the sciences of heraldry and genealogy, which have since had a profitable life right down to our own day. The first English duke was created in 1337, an expression of the tendency to find ways of singling out the greater magnates from among their peers. Symbolic questions of precedence became the of intense interest. Rank was at stake. From this rose the dread of disparagement, the loss of status which might follow for a woman from an unequal marriage or for a man from contamination by a lowly occupation. For centuries, most noblemen in the northern Europe took it for granted that only arms, the church, or the management of their own estates were fit occupations for their like. Trade, above all, was closed to them except through agents. Even when centuries later this barrier gave way, hostility to retail trade was the last thing to be abandoned by those who cared for about these things. When a 16th century French king called his Portuguese cousin a grocer king, he was being rude as well as witty, and no doubt his courtiers laughed at the sneer. The values of the nobility were, at bottom, military. Through their gradual refinement, there emerged slowly the notions of honor, loyalty, and disinterested self sacrifice, which were to be held up as models for centuries to well born boys and girls. The ideal of chivalry articulated these values and softened the harshness of a military code. It was blessed by the church, which provided religious ceremonies to accompany the bestowal of knighthood and the knight's acceptance of Christian duties. The heroic figure who came supremely to embody the notion was the mythological English king Arthur, whose cult spread to many lands. It was to live on in the ideal of the gentleman and gentlemanly conduct, however qualified in practice. Of course, it never worked as it should have done. But few great creative myths do. Neither did the feudal theory of dependence, nor does democracy. The pressures of war and, more fundamentally, economics were always at work to fragment and confuse social obligations. The increasing reality of the feudal concept of lord and vassal was one factor favoring the growth of kingly power. The coming of a money economy made further inroads. Service had increasingly to be paid for in cash, and rents became more important than the services that had gone with them. Some sources of feudal income remained fixed in terms made worthless by changes in real prices. Lawyers evolved devices which enabled new aims to be realized within a feudal structure more and more unreal and worm eaten. Medieval nobility had been for a long time very open to new entrants, but usually became less and less true as time passed. In some places, attempts were actually made to close forever a ruling caste. Yet, European society was all the time generating new kinds of wealth and even of power which could not find a place in the old hierarchies and challenged them. The most obvious example was the emergence of rich merchants. They often bought land. It was not only the supreme economic investment in the world where there were few, but it might open the way to a change of status for which land ownership was either a legal or social necessity. In Italy, merchants sometimes themselves became the nobility of trading and manufacturing cities. Everywhere, though, they posed a symbolic challenge to a world which had to begin with no theoretical place for them. Soon, they evolved their own social forms, guilds, mysteries, corporations, which gave new definitions to their social role. The rise of the merchant class was almost a function of the growth of towns. The appearance of merchants was inseparably linked with the most dynamic element in medieval European civilization. Unwittingly, at least at first, towns and cities held within their walls much of the future history of Europe. Though their independence varied greatly in law and practice, there were parallels in other countries to the Italian communal movement. Towns in the German East were especially independent, which helps to explain the appearance there of the powerful Hanseatic League of more than 150 free cities. The Flemish towns also tended to enjoy a fair degree of freedom. French and English towns usually had less, yet lords everywhere sought the support of cities against kings, while kings sought the support of townsmen and their wealth against over mighty subjects. They gave towns charters and privileges. The walls which surrounded the medieval city were the symbol as well as a guarantee of its immunity. The landlord's writ did not run in them, and sometimes their anti feudal implication was even more explicit. Villains, for example, could acquire their freedom in some towns if they lived in them for a year and a day. The air of the town makes men free, said a German proverb. The communes and within them, the guilds were associations of free men for a long time, isolated in a world unfree. The burgher and the bourgeois. The dweller in burg or borough was a man who stood up for himself in a universe of dependence. Much of the history behind this remains obscure because it is for the most part the history of obscure men. The wealthy merchants who became the typically dominant figures of the new town life and fought for their corporate privileges are visible enough, but their humbler predecessors are usually not. In the earlier times, a merchant can have been little but the peddler of exotica and luxuries which the medieval European state could not provide for itself. Ordinary commercial exchange for a long time hardly needed a middleman. Craftsmen sold their own goods and cultivators their own crops. Yet, somehow, in the towns there emerged men who dealt between them, and the countryside and their successors were to be men using capital to order in advance the whole business of production for the market. In the blossoming of its urban life lies buried much which made European history different from that of other continents. Neither in the ancient world, except perhaps classical Greece, nor in Asia or America, did city life develop the political and social power it came to show in Europe. One reason was the absence of destructively parasitic empires of conquest to eat away at the will to betterment. Europe's enduring political fragmentation made rulers careful of the geese which laid the golden eggs. they needed to compete with their rivals. A great sack of a city was a noteworthy event in the European Middle Ages. It was the inescapable and recurrent accompaniment of warfare in much of Asia. This, of course, could not be the whole story. It also must have mattered that, for all its obsession with status, Europe had no caste system such as that of India, no ideological homogeneity so intense and stultifying as China's. Even when rich, the city dwellers of other cultures seem to have acquiesced in their own inferiority. The merchant, the craftsman, the lawyer, and the doctor had roles in Europe, though which at an early date made them more than simple appendages of landed society. Their society was not closed to change and self advancement. It offered routes to self improvements other than the warriors or the court favorites. Townsmen were equal and free, even if some were more equal than others. It need not surprise us that practical, legal, and personal freedom was much greater for men than for women, though there were still those of both sexes who were legally unfree at the bottom of the society. Whether they were of noble or common blood, medieval European women suffered by comparison with their menfolk from important legal and social disabilities, just as they had done in every civilization which has ever existed. Their rights of inheritance were often restricted. They could inherit a fief, for example, but could not enjoy personal lordship and had to appoint men to carry out the obligations that went with it. In all classes below the highest, there was much drudgery to be done by women. Even in the 20th century, there were European peasant women who worked on the land as women still do in Africa and Asia today. There were theoretical elements in the subjection of women, and a large contribution was made to them by the Church. In part, this was a matter of its traditionally hostile stance towards sexuality. Its teaching had never been able to find any justification for sex except for its role in the reproduction of the species. Women, being seen as the origin of man's fall and a standing temptation to concupiscence, the church threw its weight behind the domination of society by men. Yet this is not all there is to be said. Other societies have done more to seclude and oppress women than Christendom, and the church at least offered women the only respectable alternative to domesticity available until modern times. The history of the female religious is studied with outstanding women of learning, spirituality, and administrative gifts. The position of at least a minority of well born women, too, was marginally bettered by the idealization of women in the chivalric codes of behavior of the 13th and 14th centuries. There lay in this a notion of romantic love and an entitlement to service, a stage towards a higher civilization. At bottom, no Christian church could ever deny to women so much as was denied them in some other cultures. The deepest roots of what later generations were to think of as the liberation of women lie, for this reason, in Western culture, whose role in so many places was to be disturbing, exotic, and revolutionary. Yet, such ideas in the Middle Ages can have had little impact even on the lives of European women. Among themselves, medieval European women were more equal before death than would be rich and poor women in Asia today. But then so were men. Women lived less long than men. It seems, and frequent confinements and a high mortality rate no doubt explain this. Medieval obstetrics remain as did other branches of medicine rooted in Aristotle and Galen. There was nothing better available. But men died young too. Aquinas lived only to 47, and philosophy is not nowadays thought to be physically exacting. This was about the age to which a man of 20 in a medieval town might normally expect to survive. He was lucky to have got as far already and to have escaped the ferocious toll of infant mortality, which imposed an average life of about 33 years and a death rate about twice that of modern industrial countries. Judged by the standards of antiquity, so far as they can be grasped, this was, of course, by no means bad. This reminds us of one last novelty in the huge variety of Middle Ages. They left behind the means for us to measure just a little more of dimensions of human life. From these centuries come the first collections of facts upon which reasoned estimates can be made. When in 1087 William the Conqueror's officers rode out into England to interrogate its inhabitants and to record its structure and wealth in the Domesday Book, they were unwittingly pointing the way to a new age. Other collections of data, usually for tax purposes, followed in the next few centuries. Some have survived together with the first accounts, which reduced farming and business to quantities. Thanks to them, historians can talk with a little more confidence about late medieval society than about that of any earlier time.